Good morning, gentlemen. It's a bright sunshine, and I'm going to talk to you about Ukraine. You all know how the war started in Ukraine, so I'm not going to go into those details. But before I proceed further, I'll let you know that Ukraine is the most important hotspot in the world, much more important than the Gaza Strip or the South Pacific, East Pacific, and any other place in the world. Because this is the place which could be the matchstick that lights World War III. You all know it was instigated by the Americans, and Donald Trump has promised that he will stop this war. It's a very big promise, and I'm going to examine whether he is going to succeed, and if he succeeds, how's he going to go about it. He hasn't laid out any plan, but I have got an idea of what he's planning, and we'll discuss that here. Now, as things stand, the Russians are in the ascendance in Ukraine, and I don't think Ukraine can last much longer. That's my view. Ukraine's leader Zelensky will have to go. That is the second point, in case Donald Trump has to make peace in Ukraine. So, like the old saying, you have to spend something to get something. So, the Americans will have to stop supporting Zelensky. That's the first thing. Now, I couldn't understand what was the problem with Joe Biden in the sense that he went and hammer and tongs in support of Zelensky when he abandoned Afghanistan and ran away from there like rats leaving a sinking ship. That also you can't forget. And Joe Biden, which brought about so much of humiliation in the American military after his campaign in Afghanistan, wanted to retrieve the situation in Ukraine by giving weapons, and he was very confident. I think his chief of staff had told him that we'll be able to bring Russia to its knees, and we will be in a position very shortly to have complete dominance over Europe for the next 100 years. Well, I thought he was a little silly, and that statement which he made in Ukraine when he went there and said, I'm going to support Ukraine for as long as it gets. What does he mean by that? That means forever. He didn't realize that he's paying for the war with the hard-earned money of the American taxpayer. Trump has realized it because he wants to focus on the economy of the Americans. And he had also said that he will stop this insane war as quickly as possible. Now, it's not going to be easy. Let's be very frank about it. First thing is, the Russians have occupied about 20% of the territory, including the Crimea, and they are not going to give up that territory. And Ukraine has said that there can be no peace unless the Russians vacate that territory. The only via media is that the first thing is Zelensky is asked to go home. Maybe, I have a feeling that it's my personal feeling. It doesn't mean anything. He needs to be tried as a war criminal. The amount of trouble, the amount of sorrow, the amount of penury which he has brought on the Ukrainian people is something which is kind of described. 20% of the population is a refugee in Europe. They're fighting a war. They don't have men to fight now. Still, he is insisting on the West weapons to come in so he could attack Russia and continue with the war. And he was also of the view that the sanctions on Russia will work. They haven't worked. The Russians have survived, and not only that, the economy has bloomed. That's also what the report says. Anyway, gentlemen, now Donald Trump has got to bite the bullet. And how is he going to bite it? The first thing is, as far I think his suggestion is, that there's a freeze on the present border, there's a ceasefire. But that's got a big question mark whether Zelensky is going to accept it, because that would mean a lot of territory remaining with the hands of the Russians. Then Donald Trump wants that the border between the two forces, that is the Ukrainian force and the Russian force, has a buffer zone of say about 10 miles or 15 miles, and that to be policed by the British and the French. Now, why the British and the French? I mean, I could not really understand it. Why not the Indians or the Chinese or somebody like that, or some African countries? But as the saying goes, he doesn't trust them. And the only country he would trust are the whites again, because he's a white supremacist, basically. I don't think Russians are going to accept it, that's number one. But that is his plan. And after that, he said we can sit and discuss what is to be done. That means the war would be stopped, but in effect, it would mean that NATO will not expand eastwards further to Ukraine. That's one. Secondly, Ukraine will have to accept that part of their territory is occupied by Russia. This is not conducive to peace. The war may be stopped, but it will flare up again. Because now the situation is changed. Russians have been fighting for over 2.5 years, and I'm afraid they have had very little to show after the 2.5 years of fighting. You know, the famed Russian army, the Red Army, which held the Wehrmacht at bay and ousted them and defeated them in the battles of Stalingrad and the plains of Ukraine, with the famous tank battles around Kharkiv and Kiev. And that somehow hasn't materialized. And the net result has been that the Russians' advances have been very tardy. They hardly moved forward. I thought by now they should have at least captured Odisha and reached the Dnieper River, which they didn't. So the question now is, what is Donald Trump going to do? The Russians, I don't know whether they're looking for peace. What is the mind of Putin? I wish I was a genius or a genie who comes out from the bottle and could go and read the mind of Vladimir Putin. But my way of thinking is Putin is now hell-bent after the betrayals by the Americans at every stage to assert the ascendancy of Russia in Eastern Europe. He could demand a rollback of NATO, that is Poland and the few eastern, the Baltic countries, to be taken out of NATO. Because NATO, all it's said and done, is a paper tiger. I don't see how NATO is going to be effective at all. And Trump at one stage had said that NATO is an obsolete organization. Let's not forget that fact. So the problem, gentlemen, is very, very extreme as far as I can see it. And I don't know how the Americans are going to go about it, or rather Donald Trump. Because what he suggests is a very simplistic solution, but obviously it is a step. It's a step in the right direction. Somebody's got to make a proposal, and he's made the proposal. We'll have to see how is he going to succeed. And the proposal he's made is very clear. Have a ceasefire at the moment, create a buffer zone, let it be policed by neutral troops like the British and the French. But then they are not neutral troops. They have been fighting Russia all the time. Not physically, but emotionally and mentally. And our good friend, the French President Macron, has gone on record and said that Russia, under no circumstances, should be allowed to win. He said that. You can't forget it. So Trump is again going in a different direction. I don't think it's going to really help out if he's going to think in those lines. If he's wise and he really wants to make use of his tenure, the first thing should be an announcement of the rollback of NATO in Eastern Europe. Now, I say, will Trump have the courage to do that? That means rollback means handing over Poland, Hungary, and all the smaller states, Finland, etc., who have joined out of NATO. Take them out of NATO. In any case, they got no use. I mean, they're just liability on NATO. They got very small armies. They got nothing to do, and they're living in basking that the famous theory MAD, mutual assured destruction, is going to save them. They don't realize that they'll never be saved in the conflict, you know. And these small countries, I think one or two or three hydrogen bombs, thermonuclear bombs, would be the end of them. They would cease to exist on the world map. It's very sad, but that's precisely what's likely to happen. if the present conflict continues, and if NATO continues thinking that we'll keep our eastern borders intact. Because if you keep the eastern borders intact, and that means you keep countries in the Baltic states like Estonia and Latvia as part of NATO, what does it mean? It means like a dagger in the heart of the Russians. And that is the point. Whether Putin is going to accept this particular proposal which has been outlined by Donald Trump. Of course, part of the proposal is that NATO will not expand to Ukraine for the next 20 years. That means after 20 years, Ukraine will not be made a member of NATO. But what happened after 20 years? 20 years in the history of the world is a small time. And that time Putin won't be alive, and neither would be Donald Trump. And who knows what's going to happen? I mean, it's so dicey, gentlemen. That's what I'm trying to say is this is not a solution to permanent peace. The only way you can have a permanent peace is that if NATO rolls back the eastern territories which it has incorporated and had been promised by Bill Clinton to Boris Yeltsin. The Americans broke that promise. Can Donald Trump restore it? He's capable of it. He's quite good at it. But that means he would be turning his back on the Western alliance. And that I don't think he is really interested in doing. Because he talks a lot, but practically his results have not been that commensurate. He was talking at one time before he took over his first term that NATO is an obsolete organization. But he finally backed it up. He was talking that Russia he would deal differently, but he was harsher than Obama, and so many Russians were expelled when he was the president of America. So he's a man who's a maverick. I don't really say he's looking for glory. And you don't get glory, by making some weird proposals and thinking that they'll go through. America's got power, but Russia has also got power. So it's not something that the Americans shove down the throat of the Russians. And the next step is, how long can America keep on fighting in Ukraine? Because this is basically a proxy war of America. America is also going down economically. I think they got a debt of $3 or $4 trillion, and it's a budget fiscal deficit, and they'll have to think about how they're going to get over it. And more wars, more and more supply of weapons to Ukraine, etc., is going to be very deleterious for them, especially when they have a big problem in the Gaza Strip also. And then there's a belligerent China facing them in the South China Sea. And they got a lot of liabilities. Similarly, as they got these small countries in Europe, they got those countries in Southeast Asia, like South Korea, Japan, the Philippines, North Vietnam, all these countries, they got no great power, nothing. They're just catching the coat label of the Americans and thinking that they'll be saved from China that way. Then it's a very complex situation which I'm telling you. It's not something which you can really say, "Bhai, aisa ho jayega, it will happen like this," or something like that. Of course, Trump has got some very revolutionary ideas, and he did it earlier, like he brought about that Abraham Accord when a couple of Arab countries established diplomatic relations with Israel. I mean, all credit to him. But Ukraine is going to be a hard net to crack, because of Vladimir Putin and the Russians. Actually, Putin is supported by China, there's no doubt about it. And to an extent, it's got an ambivalent support from India, which is also not prepared to forsake the Russians. Because India cannot forget that in the 71 war, when President Nixon was blowing hot and cold, it was the Russians who stood by India at that time. So, gentlemen, Donald Trump has got a big nut to crack. How's he going to do it? As I've told you, his present proposal falls short of what the Russians would be expecting. Russia doesn't want a ceasefire in the territories which they have got, which are small territories with them, and it's leave a status quo for say 10 or 20 years, and then the same situation starts again. And where the guarantee after Donald Trump is out, the next American president reverses all that. After all, Bill Clinton reversed his own words to the Russians that he won't expand eastward, and he expanded eastwards. So, gentlemen, it's not something so simple, and we'll have to stick and watch what's happening. It's a question of eyeball to eyeball, you know. And the question is, who is going to blink? Would it be Donald Trump or Vladimir Putin? Putin actually it would be the loser in every case. In case there is a ceasefire, he's a loser because in that case also, despite having some territory of Ukraine under his control, the entire Ukraine would be free. And Ukraine was a part of the USSR, it was a part of Russia. And many Soviet leaders, including Nikita Khrushchev, were from Ukraine. So they would be losers. And Ukraine would be out of their orbit. And they would be hands off from the other East European countries. So I don't think Russians will accept this particular thing. Russians would be looking forward to one thing, that the Americans stop the military support to Ukraine. I think that is very important. And advise Ukraine to negotiate directly with the Russians. That should be the case. Because sometimes intermediaries don't work. Donald Trump wanted to be the arbiter, between India and Pakistan. He even offered to arbitrate between India and China on Siachen. But again, I think he's a bit simplistic about it. Everything he sees from the money angle, and that is not the way things work out in politics. He's a good businessman. I believe he's going to set up 10 Trump towers in India. That's fine. I welcome it. But one can't be simplistic in such policies. The Americans are going to be at hard pressed in Ukraine because they bit off more they can chew. And it is now the Americans which want to call the war off because of the drain on their weapons, which are costing them billions of dollars in supplying to Ukraine. And there is no sign of victory. And inch by inch, the Russians are pulverizing the Ukrainians. So, what is the solution? The solution is one and simple, a regime change in Ukraine. That's number one. Because Ukraine was a friend of the Americans at that time when the Americans carried out a coup, ousted the president and brought in an anti-Russian. They expanded NATO eastwards, so you have to pay the price. That's what the Gita says. What you sow, so shall you reap. So we'll have to wait, gentlemen, and see what is going to happen. It's not going to be so simple. The only way is there's a regime change and NATO is rolled back eastwards, and the realization comes that NATO is an obsolete organization. It can't fight it for nuts, let me tell you. Is NATO going to go and fight China? I don't think so. Even if tomorrow, I give an example, the Russians invade Estonia. Is NATO going to go to war with Russia on that? Are the Americans going to have a war with Russia? You've already tried out in Ukraine. All sorts of help has been given to Ukraine, the maximum help, tanks, weaponry, sophisticated weapons, but Ukraine has not been able to use them. Even the F-16 are utterly useless in the hands of the Ukrainian pilots were a big zero. And the only way Ukraine is surviving is because of the aid being given, the war aid rather being given by the Americans. A lot of that money is coming to Dubai, I'm told. A lot of money going into the American war machine, and quite a bit of it going into the pockets of the Ukrainian leadership, who know that tomorrow if they lose, they can all run away to London or the Bahamas and all that and sit in the sunlight, with a big sea beach bungalow. Ukraine be damned. I mean, I hope Donald Trump knows all this. So it is in the interest of America to stop the war totally, number one. Stop the funding of weapons to Ukraine. Number two, insist on the removal of Zelensky and negotiate with the Russians on the status of Eastern Europe. I see no other way this matter can be processed further. Gentlemen, I hope you like this video. Please, if you like it, share it with your friends and come back for more. In the meanwhile, I'll say Goodbye. God bless. Jai Hind. Till we meet again.